Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Bug Jar. Today we're going to be talking about how various forms of art have influenced us over the years with our music, and how we think it's really important for anybody who does anything creatively to be constantly immersing themselves in good art that's outside of the realm of what they do. So we do music, but on top of that we love so many other things. So we wanted to talk a little bit about things that have inspired us over the years.
So, I've always been a big film buff, especially for some reason movies from the 70s. 70s and early 80s are some of my favorite movies of all time. One I'm going to talk about today is The Shining, the original Shining, with Jack Nicholson, directed by Stanley Kubrick. So one thing I like about that movie that has inspired my music is that there's a really obvious story up front with Jack Nicholson's crazy acting and the really interesting cinematography and the guy going crazy and trying to murder his family and all that kind of stuff. But then there's tons of subtext in that movie. And if you want to get into all the weird stuff that's going on, there's all kinds of documentaries and stuff out there about it. But there's like scenes that are shot in a way that the architecture of the building would be impossible. There's, you know, the maze metaphor. There's all kinds of interesting stuff, from the way the opening shot is this big open expansive, you know, mountain shot, and then by the end of the movie you've basically closed into being enclosed inside of that little maze, the hedge maze thing. But the point being is that I like writing music that there's this surface level, like really obvious take on what I'm talking about. You can just listen to the beat, listen to the melodies and enjoy it, and like just kind of pay a little bit of attention to the words. If you dig deeper into it, there's more that you can get out of it, I hope, for most people. And I like putting things in my songs like that. I like putting little points for people who are paying extra attention. Like one of my good friends, Dusty Lunsford, was recently listening to our debut album, and he really enjoyed the little repeating licks after the chorus of Brown Mountain Lightning Bugs, and he said, "Oh, I just noticed that there's a different instrument playing that lick every time." So even just musically, I like putting little things that if you pay a little bit more attention, there's something in there that you can like kind of pick up on and be like, "Oh, I hadn't noticed that before."
So one of the films that has inspired me, since we're going with film to start with, weirdly enough, is a movie called Hugo, which is based on the book The Invention of Hugo Cabret. And I saw that movie, I've only ever seen it once, and I really love the aesthetic of it. It's kind of steampunk-ish, a little more like ethereal, almost fantasy kind of steampunk, but it's about this little boy who finds this automaton that his dad was working on. And I loved the visual style of the movie, and I liked the story. I thought it was a sweet story and interesting. And so when I was in undergrad, I got really, really into it, and actually one of the very first pieces I composed was based on parts of that story. So in the story, there's a lot to do with clocks and clockmaking, and so I learned a little bit about clocks and watches and how they're made and the different parts and components of them. And over the last, I guess, 5 years, I've been steadily working on a series of piano pieces based around not only the parts of a clock, but how those parts relate to our lives. So, for example, there's a piece called the escapement wheel, and that's what makes the clock tick. So every time you hear a clock tick, it's because the wheel is turning and there's a little arm that comes down and smacks into the wheel, and that's what makes the tick. But also I like the idea of escaping and escapism, and so I composed this little piano piece that's very French in style, which the movie is set in France. But it's supposed to be very whimsical and kind of taking you out of where you are into somewhere different and ethereal and lovely and all those things. So that's my film thing. It's a little less intense. It's a kid's movie. We go from one end of the spectrum to the other here.
So outside of doing music, I've been a writer And I've actually done that longer than I've played music. I've been writing poems and stuff since I was very, very young. One of my favorite writers ever is Cormac McCarthy, known especially for the book The Road that came out a few years back, 2006 I think. But he's written a whole series of novels that were westerns basically, and they started with this one called All the Pretty Horses. And that's my favorite of his. And his writing is just, it's interesting because he does away with a lot of the typical rules that you associate with grammar and things. That the way that they teach you in school to write, he throws about half that out the window. He doesn't use quotation marks on any dialogue ever. So you kind of have to interpret the dialogue and who's speaking based on context, which if the context is good enough and what's being said is good enough, then it makes sense. And I don't know, it just makes you engage with the dialogue in a way that if you were having these little quotation marks that clearly outline everything for you, it kind of, I don't know, it makes you pay attention in a way that makes you really engage with the story. A lot of his writing is that way. It's very much poetry in sort of a long form. And I just really love his imagery. I love his doing away with rules. And that has inspired me musically because I know enough music theory to get myself in trouble, basically. And a lot of times what I'm doing with songs I write and lyrics that I write and things that I put together compositionally, it's like, I know what is the right way to do this. Now let me just toss that out the window and try to do something that is not necessarily the proper way things should be done. So that definitely inspires me musically.
So an author who has inspired me musically, both in my songwriting and in my composition, has been Terry Pratchett. Which again, seems like we're going in divergent directions here in terms of seriousness. So if you've not read any of his books, Terry Pratchett writes what is essentially like a satirical version of high fantasy with like wizards and elves and goblins and all those kinds of things, but it's done to kind of poke fun at the genre. And it's downright hilarious and brilliant, and I crack up, and every page is just beautifully written and so funny and witty that like you just feel smarter reading it because you know this guy was obviously a genius. And I started reading his books a few years ago after Zach recommended them, and I just got hooked on the story and the characters, particularly Death and all of his various iterations. I think he's one of the most interesting characters ever. So I've written not only some songs that were inspired by the Discworld books, but I've actually written a couple pieces of music that were inspired by that as well, that were not songs, that were like stuff for instrumental kind of things. So one was inspired by the book Mort. That was the song that Zach and I actually wrote together. I think he did the music and I did the lyrics, and the lyrics were based on one of the kind of culminating scenes in the book. And I'm not going to spoil it for you if you haven't read it, but you should go read it. That's where that song came from. And then I wrote a clarinet piece inspired by Tiffany Aching and her series. You're just looking for something lighthearted to make you laugh, and also sometimes to make you think. Grab a Terry Pratchett book. They're totally worth it.
And the guy can literally drop a gut-busting pun per sentence.
Oh my god!
Like in one page, you can like have 10 laughs. It's insane.
It's so witty. It is like the. And for those of you who are not super familiar with Terry Pratchett, if you've seen Good Omens on Amazon Prime, that was a co-write between Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. So if you enjoyed Good Omens and thought it was brilliant, you'll love anything else that Terry Pratchett put his hands in. It's all good.
The last thing I'm going to talk about is a painter named Rene Magritte. And I'm sure I'm going to pronounce his name and his painting's name wrong because he was Belgian, and I'm going to have trouble with this being from Western North Carolina. But particularly his painting Le Château des Pyrenees. So anyway, He is a surrealist. One of the more famous examples of surrealism is Salvador Dali, and I enjoy his stuff, but my favorite surrealist painter is definitely Rene Magritte. And it's what I like about surrealism, and his in particular, is that a lot of his paintings are very simple. For Le Chateau des Pyrenees, it's just basically a rock island in the sky with a little castle on top of it, right? But it sets your brain off of thinking, like, how did this rock get to be floating in the sky? What kind of person lives there? Like, it just sends my brain off into the cosmos of all these possibilities based on this relatively simple, image. And the same thing is true of almost every piece of art that he has. He has the paintings of the guys in suits with little bowler hats, and their faces are covered up with fruit or violins or different kinds of things. And it's like an apple right in front of this person's face, and it makes you question who this person is, what kind of expression they're having. Because like taking that person's expression away and covering it up with this apple, like you don't know what the person's there for. They could be smiling, they could be having a menacing look on their face. But I like that there's this interpretive nature to his works, and that has inspired me musically, because I like for my work to not necessarily, okay, this is the meaning, this is exactly what it's all about. I want people to be able to interpret it and take it to their own conclusions. But also, I want it to be open enough that there's not a definitive conclusion. Like, even if you have a conclusion about what a song is about, I want you to still have this nagging suspicion in the back of your head that maybe I'm not quite right on that, because there's this one element that doesn't quite make sense. But I love that. I love that sort of ambiguity, and his work in particular has really inspired me in that way.
So I'm going to diverge a little bit on this one, rather than going with visual art and talking about something else that really inspires me, that it's still, it's an art form, and we haven't really touched on it yet, and it's very visual in nature. And that's dance. I really, really love contemporary dance. And it's one of those things where it gets made fun of a lot. And people are always like, oh, interpretive dance. And it's not the same thing. But when I was in graduate school, I got to do this thing called Dance a Day, where you work with a choreographer as a composer. And you compose something to set their movement to. And I got paired up on my first day with a choreographer named Rosa Shavelyeva, who has been absolutely amazing, and I've gotten to work with her on a lot of things. I'm working with her right now. And there are no non-musicians who love music the way that dancers do. And it just blows my mind, their intuition around music. And working with dancers and with choreographers has helped me think of music differently than I normally would. Because the way they think of phrasing is different from how a musician is typically trained to think of phrasing. The way they think of space and movement and propulsion is very different. And weight and color and timbre, it's all very outside of the realm of how a lot of musicians are trained to think about music. And so being around dancers and watching choreography is always really refreshing to me, because it sparks my brain thinking in a different direction. So if you're somebody who hasn't watched a whole lot of contemporary dance and your knowledge of it might be a little bit limited, because honestly, before I was really around dancers, I hadn't gone out of my way to watch a whole lot of choreography. I'd seen some stuff and was like, oh, that's kind of cool. But I hadn't really delved into it the way I did when I actually started working with human beings who are dancers. And so I would encourage you to go out and watch some stuff, and not just ballet. Ballet is awesome, and I love it too. But go see something that's different and see what you think of it and why you think that way, and actually talk to the dancers if you can and learn a little bit about it, because it's a whole different fascinating world, and I've absolutely had a blast being a part of it in some small way. That's pretty much it for today. We hope that you enjoyed us talking about stuff that we are passionate about and we really like. And we would love for you to share some media that you love in the comments below. Suggest some stuff to us that maybe we've never seen or never listened to or never really experienced. We're always just absolutely thrilled to find new stuff to enjoy and be inspired by. So thanks again for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you again next week.